guys, this is Kyle with Auditing with Autism, back again for another episode of fun information about philosophy. I also like to talk about music and autism. Sometimes I talk about world events and other things, but today I'm going to be talking a little bit about philosophy and sociology, psychology. Basically, I wanted to get into the topic of consensus and propaganda and psychology and how it affects us as humans as we run around in the world. Propaganda, it affects us a lot because it can affect how we make decisions in the world. And so I think it's an important topic because this is something that humans have had to deal with ever since we have started having vocal language and basically coming up with reasons for why other people should be convinced to do what an individual may want them to do. It's completely logical and reasonable to imagine wanting somebody else to do something for the reasons that you want. This is how basically the golden rule works, or cooperation, alignment of activity. It's a good idea. It's a good idea. And propaganda, doesn't have to be bad exactly, but it usually is. And it can lead to consensus, which is usually a good thing. Consensus, is on one side of the spectrum, and then on the other side, we would have mob rule, So I'm going to go ahead and just start with a definition for these terms, just to get us on the same page, And I got these definitions from the internet, Wikipedia and Merriam-Webster dictionary and that kind of stuff. And it says propaganda is a communication tactic that is used to persuade and indoctrinate an audience. Persuading and indoctrinating an audience, basically convincing them for your reasons. You have a reason for something to happen. You use a little propaganda to convince an audience. Propaganda is nothing new, although I'm going to read in the book here a little bit, my quote book, I'm going to read a little bit of a very short quote about the origin of propaganda itself. But I just want to keep in mind that propaganda didn't start in the 1600s, like I'm about to read it. Propaganda is something that we've seen for thousands of years, and it's classically been called, the word we use to call it is rhetoric. Rhetoric is the technique of using language to convince others for your reasons. And so, when we see propaganda coming into the human condition, the world sphere, in the 17th century, it becomes more than rhetoric. It becomes a commercial for rhetoric. It becomes a group of people will invest their thought, time, money, and energy into pushing the rhetoric or pushing the propaganda. And so rhetoric classically has been used in debates. One person will have, an opinion about something, and they will use language to convince the other person to agree with them. And you'll see great debates, in classic history and stuff, with people using rhetoric. Personally, I don't like rhetoric because it's not authentic. People will use words and language to convince another person of something bad. Their reasons may not be very good. And so rhetoric is a powerful technique because it actually convinces another person that the other person thinks that they're using critical thinking in agreeing with your opinion. I know that's a little complicated, but let me just go on. I'll say the definition of consensus. Consensus, according to Merriam-Webster dictionary, is using our critical thinking to gain an agreement that is in unison. Getting an agreement that is in unison is what we do in democracy. And so it's a very good thing. But the difference between the difference between consensus and, say, mob rule is critical thinking. In a consensus society, people have the ability to use critical thinking, and therefore they need education. They need to know how to use critical thinking. They need to learn how to use it so that they can have a better consensus. And just on a personal note, it seems to me that, in the last few hundred years and recently, it seems to me that the powers that be, would like to remove our ability to have critical thinking. They would like us to not be thinking about things so much and just be emotionally influenced, and that leads me to mob rule. Mob rule is just a rule of passion over reason. Passion over reason. If you can get people to have passion over their reason, then you can also control people. And that's, obviously the goal, the will to power for most of history has been, for the leaders, the controllers, the powerful people in the world have used will to power to gain their power. And then oftentimes they will do that in a terrible way to other people using mob rule and, pushing down our ability to do critical thinking. And so that's where I kind of want to step in. I'm going to show really quickly why that is a dangerous thing and how it can take away from our, what I would call our human nature. Our human nature really is to learn about things and discuss what we've learned in an open and safe, authentic way with other people. And then when we have all shared what we're learning in an open, safe way, we get to, as a group, just, think about it critically and make choices that will push us forward in a better situation. And that's what I think of democracy when I think of true democracy, not a democracy that is led by representatives that are being influenced by lobbyists and special interest money. No, not that. I'm thinking about, true democracy where every man and woman on the land has the ability to critically think about people's reasons, their position in the world, and then share that with other people as a way to maybe influence others openly and honestly and safely. Influence other people on what may be the right choice and decisions to move forward. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about how. First, I'm going to bring up an interesting point of how the powers that be use their power and how they use their power to control the masses. And this is going to be interesting to some of you, I think. This is just hard facts. Check this out. In 2002, there was a bill passed in Congress. And the bill passed in 2002 in Congress gave essentially 70% of our voting machines, 70% of our voting machines across the land was given into the hands of a small number of corporations in 2002. You know what I mean? This was like a year after 9/11. And by the way, it's pretty obvious to me when you read history, the history of the world, that the powerful elite, the top 1% that have always tried to stay on top and control the human masses, they use a technique to control us called trauma bonding. And when I see things like, for example, more recently in history, like JFK, then we see, MLK, and then we see the riots in May. This all happens, within a few years of each other. I mean, just think about this. In 90 days, in 1968, in less than 100 days, we saw the death of MLK, Martin Luther King Jr. We saw in May the riots that went all across the United States and Europe in colleges, where students were protesting against the war and what was going on politically. And it was a huge, huge protest. It looked to me like, when you read history, like in 1968, like the students were going to uprise and revolt successfully, like we saw the young people do in Nepal recently, where they revolted and took over the government. Well, that was happening in 1968 after MLK was killed, because 4 years before we saw JFK assassinated. Then there was MLK 4 years later in March. And then in May, we saw the revolts. And boy, they came in and crushed the revolt. Well, as a result of all of that, we saw a new presidential candidate, a candidate for the people, a lot of us thought, and that was Robert, RFK. Robert Kennedy was the brother of John F. Kennedy and was running as president. And he had just successfully obtained the Democratic nomination the very same night that he was assassinated. And I think that was in June. So within 100 days, MLK was, and then we saw the riots, and then we saw RFK assassinated. And so this caused a trauma bond. This caused trauma, of course, to everybody. And that's what the power elite wants. They want us to think about those moments instead of the moment I'm about to describe. Well, I just described. They don't want you to remember. They would rather, let me put it this way, they would rather have you remember 9/11 than that a year later a bill was passed in 2002 that gave over 70% of our voting machines into the hands of private corporations. One of the corporations, by the way, is a company called Diebold. Diebold, Diebold. It's I mean, these names are just too bold. It's too ironic sometimes to be a coincidence. Well, that happened in 2002, and they don't want you to think about that. Again, I'm thinking, I'm thinking that the reasoning here is the elite wants us to only remember 9/11 and not what happened, to our rights after that as humans. Well, 2 years after the voting machines were given to private corporations, if I can find it here, let's see if I can find it. Yeah. 2 years later, in 2004, check this out, 7 Senate races suffered major anomalies when the exit polls differed as much as 13% from the final machine tally. In every case, the trailing Republican candidate was declared the surprise winner. So 2 years before this happens, Congress passes this law that gives 70% of our voting machines over to a private corporation. And then suddenly we have these incredible anomalies happening, where exit polls are saying something completely different than the surprise, winner declared. And it all for the benefit of Republicans, the Republican Party. Boy, it really looks like, the fix was in. The fix, they are fixing the game, The power elites are causing trauma, so we'll not think about what they're doing behind the scenes. And I'm sorry if you don't agree with me on that, but I'm just talking about facts here. Another great fact, which is terrible, it's a terrible fact, actually, but this was the big one. When this happened in 2010, the game was over. We either reverse this, what I'm about to say, reverse it, and let the game continue somewhat with a semblance of fairness, or we just concede that the experiment of democracy is over because of what happened here. January 20th, 2010. I turn on the radio to hear, I write, the Supreme Court of the United States has voted 5-4 to allow incorporated business the freedom of speech to support any political candidate financially and for whatever the price. So for the first time in our history, we let big business have the same rights as a human man and woman, the freedom of speech. And at the same time, you know, equating that freedom of speech to money. So for the first time, we allow big business to give big money, unlimited money to candidates. I mean, you probably remember when Elon Musk gave $100 or $300 million to our President Trump, for his candidacy. I'm sure that helped him win. And this was something that we never allowed for before that. We would never allow big money to participate in our politics like that. It was against the rules. And it for obviously good reasons. I mean, how could we think that it's a fair game when we let these factions come in with all their money? And here I am, a single man with my single opinion, and vote for that opinion. I don't have any political capital, like literal money, to give to these politicians. So I have to say, Voltaire, he said something fantastic about democracy. He says, as a rule, no comparison can be made between the crimes of the great and those of the people, who never desire and who never can desire anything but liberty and equality. Yeah, so the crimes of the great are the crimes of the top 1%, the crimes of the people that have the power. And so he's suggesting, a couple, 300 years ago here, that he already saw that problem happening then. And so the experiment of democracy was to solve that problem. The United States was established after he said that, and so we were trying to fight against that when we established our nation 250 years ago. Hey, we're almost there. Next year, can you believe it? So I guess I just want to say something here by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. These are minds: Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke, John Locke. These are great philosophers and minds. These are people who were in the top 1% most of the time, and they knew other people that were. So they knew exactly what the problem was. But they bridged the gap between the common man and the people on the top, And so they have an opinion that I think is worthy to listen to here. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he says, usurpers always bring about or select troubles. Usurpers always bring about or select troublous times to get past under cover of the public terror, destructive laws which the people would never adopt in cold blood. And so that brings me right back to the trauma bonding where, after 9/11, we passed all kinds of laws that took away our civil rights, and so that's the whole point of them creating terror so that they can pass laws. These usurpers want to pass laws that they could never pass in normal times, so they create terrific times so that we are scared enough to acquiesce. And it's just that simple, guys. That's what's happening. And we got to know about it at least. And it's pretty scary. I'm not the most courageous man, and so I'm going to be as scared as anybody else when I see these things happen, like 9/11. But when I know that they're doing that on purpose, as terrible as it is, and all the people that get hurt, I can at least step aside and realize that it's something that's happening to me. Somebody's trying to do that to me and to us all. I want to bring in a great, so that brings us back to the idea of critical thinking and consensus, and how when we have the ability to be critical thinkers, we can overcome the fear, we can overcome the terror, and we can use logic to come to an agreement that would be beneficial for all of us, the human condition. And so I wanted to bring in, where is it? Oh my God, I'm sure I'll find it here. I'll use it. I wanted to bring in the idea of a philosopher named John Dewey. John Dewey, he's a great American philosopher from 100 years ago. He's so great. We put him on a postage stamp, and John Dewey is the kind of guy that understands a lot about philosophy and art. And so I just really quickly want to mention what John Dewey says about the purpose of life, the meaning of life. I've made videos on the meaning of life, and I have an opinion about it, and he has a really good opinion too. For John Dewey, the meaning of life, the purpose of life, is to so act as to increase the meaning of present experience. So when we, unquote, if we act so as to increase the meaning of present experience, that's really important, because that implies that we're going to use critical thinking. We're going to use logic. We're going to use, our thinking minds to come up with what that meaning is. We're going to evaluate the situation. And evaluation is the process of, or the search for, placing judgment of value. Placing judgment requires reflection. And it's in that reflection that we have critical thinking. And if you're paying attention, the propagandists use rhetoric to create mob rule so that we use passion and not our critical thinking and reflection. They would rather just have us not think about it, but, just go home, and go to sleep, basically. And so that's not the purpose of life. The purpose of life is to increase our appreciation for meaning in the present moment. And so John Dewey, I'm going to give you two more quotes by him here about art. His definition of art will help us understand how we can increase the meaning of our present experience. John Dewey says, quote, "Art is the mode of activity that is charged with meanings capable of immediately enjoyed possession. It is the complete culmination of nature and science. And science is properly a handmaiden that conducts natural events to this happy issue." So I love it, because he's suggesting that, science will lead a person to art. And I've already mentioned how I think the process of science is art in itself. And so when we play music, for example, or create illustrations, we're using all kinds of science and geometry and frequencies and things like that, without even thinking about it. But if we're thinking about it and doing science, it is a short hop, skip, and a jump to doing art. And this is why I think a lot of scientists become spiritualists, because, it leads to art. And when you get into the realm of art, it's pretty hard not to become possessed by the muse. The muse, the spirit of art. And when you get possessed by the muse, which is the root of music, you can feel it. You feel this. You feel the other side. You feel the divine. In my opinion, you feel the spiritual side of reality. It comes through you when you do art. And lastly, he says, art is the living and concrete proof that man is capable of restoring consciously, and thus on the plane of meaning, the union of sense, need, impulse, and action, characteristic of the live creature, unquote. Isn't that beautiful? I think that is maybe the epitome of the definition of art, really. I mean, you can define types of art, like I might define modern art as the absence of expectation or something like that, but just art in its entirety, it's the living and concrete proof that man is capable of restoring consciously and thus on the plane of meaning the union of sense, need, impulse, and action characteristic of the live creature. Yes, I love it. It's so great. Okay, so so this is going to take me over to Rousseau again. Let's see if I can find my quote. Sorry, guys. There's, I read so many books and I put these quotes all over the place and stuff like that. But so here's okay. So yeah, he says, whoop, he says right in here, maybe I can't find it. There it is. In a word, yeah, I'm just going to leave it with this. It seems like it's getting a little long here, but in any case, the moment a people allows it, this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau again, and he says, quote, in any case, the moment a people allow itself to be represented, it is no longer free. It no longer exists, unquote. And so I love that because he's suggesting that we lose a lot when we hire our representative to vote on our, vote for our opinion. We lose our voice. We lose our opinion, our ability for critical thinking. Why would we even participate in politics if there's somebody who's going to vote anyway, however they want to? And this is the problem with politics at its core. We have, what, 530 people or so in Congress representing 350 million people or so in the United States. That's clearly a problem. And it's, we set it up 250 years ago, and I suggest that we should change it. My idea is that we should set up a system that allows every human, every man and woman, a chance to share their opinion on any pending bill in in Congress. And eventually to get rid of Congress and just have a system set up for where the people themselves can do all the voting and lawmaking. You know, this is an idea that I hope evolves because we can use the process of uh, you know voting for laws by consensus instead of propaganda. And so that leads me into I lost my train of thought a little bit, but that leads me into the definition of these things. The Austrian-born man named Edward Bernays was the father of spin. Edward Bernays, he's the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the famous psychiatrist, and he was the first to use theories of human psychology and social science to develop engineering of consent. And so, this engineering of consent is, why he was called the father of spin. And he's basically creating a business of using propaganda to sell these spins, these stories, these ideas, to sell an idea to us so that we will, accept it and vote on it. Well, it didn't start with Edward Bernays, 100 years ago when he was alive. It started back in 1622. Check this out. Propaganda didn't originate with Bernays. It, in fact, the word propaganda originates with a committee of cardinals set up in 1622 to oversee the propagation of the Roman Catholic faith in non-Christian countries. Wow. So in 1622, the Catholic faith decided to propagate, which is how we get the word propaganda. This idea of propagating is a farming term, where you plant a seed and you propagate the farm, the field, by planting seeds that will then grow crops. And so it's a metaphor. Propaganda basically is a metaphor for planting a seed of an idea. And the Catholic Church wanted to plant the seed of an idea for their religion. And I can guess why they did that. In 1622, they were probably dealing with a lot of kickback from the atrocities that they did in during the conquest, and the time of, let's say, Cortez. There were some terrible atrocities that happened in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, perpetuated by the leaders and the church that accepted that. And of course, I will have to say here that there is no, when the church goes out and kills millions of innocent people in the name of God, there is no spirituality or goodness happening in that system, that church system. I mean, I've said before, I know I know there's truth in the Catholic Church, and so I would never throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I certainly think we need a new bath once in a while, And when I see the church killing millions of innocent people, then it's time to change the bathwater. It's definitely time to change it. Well, a lot of people probably thought that when they heard about those atrocities, and so the church came up with an idea to sell the idea of the church. And there could be a lot of good, that comes out of that too, especially if the church, for example, the church, if they had a change of spirit and they really felt it, meant it, and then they wanted to bring people back into the fold, you could use propaganda in a positive way. Propaganda is a tool, to convince people. And so whoever's using that tool, they could be good actors or bad actors, but it's just a tool. Propaganda by itself isn't evil. And at the same time, if you have somebody selling you on anything, if you don't use a critical mind and critical thinking, and you don't use reflection before you make a decision, then you're just going on passions and like a mob rule. You're not considering anything else but what you actually want, without a critical mind, without using logic. There's a great quote in here about using logic that I would love to share with us here, but I'm not sure that I can find it. I think I'll probably have to end it here since the time's getting on. I can't believe how fast it goes when I get running. And I sure am glad that you guys showed up. Thank you. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate you coming by. This quote here is by a French philosopher. He wrote this in 1990. His name is Francois Lyotard. He's one of my favorite philosophers in the modern era. He says, quote, "After some time, it happened that systems called liberal democracies came to be recognized as the most appropriate for the task of controlling events in whatever field they might occur. By leaving the programs of control open to debate, and by providing free access to the decision making roles, they maximize the amount of human energy available to the system. The effectiveness of this realistic flexibility has shown itself to be superior to the exclusively ideological, linguistic, mobilization of forces that rigidly regulated the closed totalitarian systems. So, unquote. And if you can understand that, what he's basically saying is that having an open source society where people are free and safe to share ideas with each other will create a community of consensus. And when you have a community that is based on consensus, it's working off of the golden rule. It's working off of alignment of activity. It's working off of cooperation. And that would be in the face of mob rule, which is working off of passions, on you're mad at something or you're in love with something so much that you're not thinking anything else but that love and or what's good for your neighbor. So it's really important that when we have propaganda used on us, that we remember to use our critical thinking so that we can participate in this open source democracy. And again, I think that the answer for our democracy is to really become a democracy like they had for a while, maybe 100, 200 years, a short while. In ancient Greek, where we got our word democracy from, in ancient Greece, during the time of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, they had, for a short time, they had a democracy. Now, it wasn't a democracy in the sense where women got to vote or slaves or anything like that. It was just it was every man who participated in civic life, and that's what they called a democracy. But it was already shown in their time to be superior to the rules of kings and small factions that would come by and try to usurp the power of a system or a society for their own needs and wants and desires. They are not looking out for the greater good. So looking out for the greater good of the human condition or for the human society is the point here, and I'll tie it in. It brings us back to love and the golden rule and things that are beneficial. And so it's, I think, really important to remember and something that I certainly won't forget. I wonder if maybe I can read one little spot in here with with my book. I love this book, Thus Spake Zarathustra. It's so good. And in the back of the book is an author who, in 1909, is writing about this book. He is suggesting how we could understand. It's a little bit hard to understand, Nietzsche, if you don't know a lot about his life. And he says, uh, he's talking about the sublime ones here, and he says something that I just wanted to end with that is, I think, really good. He says, he says, quote, now again, this is, let me just get his name really quick here. His name is Anthony Ludovici, and he wrote this in London in February of 1909. He says here that what Nietzsche is saying about the chapter called The Sublime Ones is that, quote, to be able to smile while speaking of lofty things and not to be oppressed by them is the secret of real greatness, unquote. So I wanted to end with that because that's a really great thing to remember, to keep our smile on and stay happy, stay reasonable, stay logical, and have a wonderful day. I love you guys. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.